Have you ever looked at a warning sign and just thought to yourself, seriously? You know, like the caution contents may be hot on a coffee cup? Yeah, of course it's hot. Well, today, we're going to dig into the surprising legal story behind why our world is absolutely filled with these seemingly obvious warnings. I mean, think about it. The wet floor sign that's still there hours after the floor is dry, or that huge list of possible side effects for a simple painkiller. It's so easy to just roll your eyes and dismiss it all as overkill. But have you ever actually stopped to ask why they're there? Well, it turns out the real reason has nothing to do with marketing or even just basic common sense. The whole story actually starts in a courtroom with one single incredibly influential case that completely flipped the script on how we think about safety and risk. Okay, so let's jump right in. We're heading back to 1980s Australia to a case called Wyong Shire Council versus Shirt. This case right here, this is basically the origin story for that entire ecosystem of warning signs we're all living in today. And what's so fascinating is that the actual details of the case, it involved a water skiing accident, by the way. They're not even the most important part. No, its real legacy is that it forced the legal system to come up with a brand new way to define what it even means to be responsible for someone else's safety. And this new standard got a name, the far-fetched test. It introduced a whole new way of looking at a legal idea called foreseeability, which, is really just a fancy way of asking a super simple question: could you have reasonably seen this coming? You see, the court had a really tricky problem on its hands. Where do you draw the line on what's foreseeable? I mean, is a meteor hitting a building a foreseeable risk? What about somebody slipping on a random banana peel in the street? They needed a clear, practical answer that could be used over and over again. And the solution they came up with? It was actually surprisingly simple. They decided that a risk is foreseeable as long as it's not far-fetched or fanciful. So basically, if you can imagine it happening, and it isn't something out of a complete fantasy novel, then it's a risk that has to be considered. And this is the exact phrase from the ruling that changed everything. Not far-fetched or fanciful. Now notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the risk has to be likely or even probable. It just has to be, well, possible. This set an incredibly low bar for what legally counts as a risk. Okay, but here's the really critical part. Just because a risk isn't fanciful doesn't automatically mean you have to build a giant fortress to prevent it. The court knew that would be impossible. So they added a second, absolutely crucial step to the process. This next part is all about weighing that risk. The court essentially created a balancing act, something a hypothetical, reasonable person would do to figure out what, if anything, should be done about a potential danger. And this slide lays out that balancing act perfectly. So on one side of the scale, you have the risk itself. How likely is it that something bad will happen, and just how bad would it be? Then on the other side of the scale, you have the response. How hard or expensive or annoying would it be to take precautions? So you see, this isn't about trying to create some perfect world with zero risk. The law isn't asking for the impossible. It's just asking for a reasonable, practical balance. If the potential for harm is really serious and the fix is super easy, well, then there's a pretty clear responsibility to act. Right, so let's bring this all back to our original question. How on earth did a legal case about water skiing in Australia from 40 years ago lead to the world of warning signs we see everywhere today? Well, this is the ripple effect. The single biggest takeaway, the idea that spread everywhere, is this. Because the test is simply whether a risk is far-fetched or fanciful, it means that even a teeny tiny, super remote possibility of something going wrong has to be taken seriously and put into that balancing act. And this is what creates the legal idea of a real risk. It might be a one-in-a-million shot, but if it's a real, tangible possibility and not just something you imagined, it has to be considered. You can't just ignore it because it's unlikely. And once you know this, you start seeing its impact absolutely everywhere. Those incredibly detailed safety briefings you get at a new job, that's this principle in action. Or think about all the signs you see at a public pool or a park. Every single one is there to address a risk that, while maybe unlikely, isn't fanciful. It's why product labels warn about every possible misuse, and why planning a big event involves massive risk assessments for everything from bad weather to crowd surges. And that brings us right back to our coffee cup. Let's do the balancing act. Is it possible someone could get seriously burned? Yep, definitely not a fanciful risk. How hard is it to print a warning on the cup? the burden is incredibly low. So the scale tips, and it tips decisively in favor of putting not warning on there. That's the logic in a nutshell. Now, there's no doubt this legal standard has made our world a lot safer in many ways. But it does leave us with a pretty interesting question to think about. In trying to account for every single risk that isn't far-fetched or fanciful, have we found the right balance, or have we created a world that's just a little too cautious? It's something to chew on the next time you see one of those signs. Thanks for tuning in.